everyone, it's Priya here, and in today's video I'm going to be doing an illustration of an octopus, and I'm going to be using watercolors and fine liners for this illustration. Now I am using my Potentate cold press watercolor square sketchbook for this illustration, and I'm starting off by just doing a sketch with graphite pencil. I'm using a HB graphite pencil, and I'm just trying to get everything, the proportions right, the placements right, just so that I have a good composition and I'm happy with how everything looks and the proportions are correct. Because although I'm doing an illustration and I'm not looking at hyperrealism for this piece, I still want to have an octopus looking like an octopus and having everything make sense for the piece, and also having everything tie in together. And once I start layering in color and once I go into the fine liner, I want to be able to have a piece that I'm going to build up layers of with watercolor and not have to go back and think, okay, I've done this wrong, or this placement has been incorrect of the tentacle or something like that. So with the spiral sketchbook, I really like the fact that I can just flip everything around and have only the artwork I'm working on, or the page that I'm working on the top. And that's something I like about the sketchbook, even though I can't do full spreads with double page spreads where the center is really separated. But with this having single page spreads, it's all pieces that artwork is just really something that I find nice about the sketchbook, having that spiral bound. So yeah, now I'm going in. That was the previous day I did the sketch, and I'm now on the next day and I am doing the inking. Now I'm using a fine liner 0.1 for this inking portion, and I've got it sped up. Even the sketch portion I had sped up because it's quite the same thing going on, and I don't want to bore you because the main thing is going to happen when I start going in with the watercolors, where I start building up layers and adding shadows. But I just want to show you the sketching portion as well as the inking portion, so that you can see that it is each stage is a different approach to the piece. Because although when I start a piece with a sketch, I'm sketching, I already have an idea of what I want the final piece to look like, and I have an idea of what colors I'm going to use, but I'm not sure if those combinations are going to actually look good once they're on paper. That's something I will see as I go along with the actual painting. But at this point, at the first stage, I just do the sketch, get the proportions right, and all the placements have to be correct of the image and the composition. When I go in with the fine liner, I am now at this point trying to make sure that all the line work is accurate, and then also just making sure that if there's anything I'm not happy with, I can just change it when I'm going in with the ink. So I can just correct things and change things, and also add a bit more detail, because this is going to be permanent, it's going to be on the final illustration. So I go in and add a bit more of those details, shadow areas, and just to indicate certain areas that I want to use lines and cross hatching, just to show those areas are going to be, and even shading to show that those areas are in shadow, and those are going to have the darker colors when I go in with the watercolors. So those are the first two stages of my illustration. Now we're going into the painting stage. Now at this stage, I'm going to be working with my watercolors and slowly building up layers and building up the shadows. Now what I'm doing now, I'm working with the octopus and just trying to cover the entire surface of the paper for the octopus, and just make sure that there's no white showing through. And I'm keeping it to the color of the octopus, but I'm keeping it very light. With watercolors, I like to work light to dark, because although you can lift up the color if you don't find it that you went down too strong in certain areas or too dark, you can lighten it up with some water and the paintbrush, and use little damp paintbrush and lift it up. But I prefer to work light to dark, then I can slowly build up the layers and build up the shadows, and also darken the areas that I need to, without making it look muddy and not have too many layers, because I try to keep the layers minimal, but at the same time I want to have those layers, because that's how I'm building up my textures and building up the image that I'm painting. Then that's what also the fine liner helps with. By having the outline, it makes it more illustrative, and it looks like an octopus but doesn't have that realism to it, but because of the outlines. But at the same time, those help me have definition to my piece when I'm going in with the watercolors, so I don't need to focus so much on trying to define, like in this case with the octopus, to define each tentacle. If I didn't have that line work done, it would be more tedious for me to try to define that using the watercolors, and not have it look like just one solid layer of just color and not have the definition in it. So that's why I like to do some fine liner work with this before I start doing the actual painting. Now it's at this point that I'm starting to add the shadows. Now that's to better define the shape of the octopus, as well as to make it look a bit more realistic to an extent, as well as make it look more three-dimensional. So even though it's not hyper realistic, it makes it look three-dimensional by focusing on the shadow areas and leaving those areas or retaining those areas that are lighter with the lighter color. And at this point I also decided I'm going to be doing a background. So my background is going to be very simple. I wanted to include some seaweed and coral, but then I thought, what, I think it's going to become too busy, so I wanted it to be a very simple piece. So I just kept it to the octopus and the background water which is going to be there, and let the focus be on the octopus itself. I don't want the piece to be too busy. Now at this point you can see I'm going in and I'm starting to add more of the shadow areas and just painting in those layers and just getting some of those textures in for the octopus skin, and just to show those layers on its body as well as on the tentacles, and getting some of those areas darker, and where they're overlapping, darkening those areas as well. Now it's at this point that you need to really focus on which areas you want to show that it is overlapping and where the shadows are falling, because that really helps to define the octopus. But at the same time, it's also necessary for me to leave it to dry between layers so that I can add the next layer on. So while I'm waiting for the first layer to go to dry, I'm just going in and adding some of the details and a little bit of a purple tone to the tentacles and the details of the tentacles. Now you can see I am now gone into working with a darker color that is the same color that I've used, but I'm just using a stronger pigment of that, and I'm using more pigment and less water. That's just to get a really define certain areas and make them darker. That'll just bring a lot of interest to the piece as well, and not look like a solid flat color that's just over the entire piece. So I'm going in again and adding some darker purples to those tentacles and the details in the tentacles. And I'm not really paying, remember, I'm not trying to make this hyper realistic. I'm not trying to make it perfect. I just want to give the indication of the suction things on the tentacles. I'm just trying to get those as defined and have some detail to them, but I'm not looking at trying to get every little detail of them as it is in a reference that I'm using. I don't want to use that to the extent where I'm just using it exactly as that is, because this is an illustration and I'm also trying to change things about into my own interpretation of it and what I want it to look like, because this is an illustration and it's not a a replica of the actual photograph that I am using for the reference. So that's another thing to remember, that your reference is a guide and it can really help you, but it's important for us as artists to take some time to use our imagination and our creative liberties to try to think of ideas of how we can make this stand out, what idea of we have in our mind. So we see our mind's idea before we find a reference. Have your idea in your mind already, so you know that this is the direction you're going to go, and then you can find a reference which can help you, guide you for details which you may not necessarily know or see in your mind, and you'll need to know that when you are actually doing the final piece. But when you have your painting and drawing, try to have an idea already in mind of how it's going to look, so that way you already have an idea, but the little details that you may miss out, then you can use the reference for guidance for that. So you can see I am now doing the background. So I'm going in a wet and wet technique for this part. I'm just laying down some water, and then I'm going in with various blues. Now obviously I'm keeping the areas to the top lighter, because the ocean is lighter at the top and it goes darker the deeper you go. So I'm keeping it lighter on the top, and then I'm darkening it as I go down. Now what I like about this is that you can see I went in with a very dark blue, and that blue just didn't suit this particular piece. So I went in and I just went over with another blue, and I blended it out because it is wet in wet, so the paper is wet and there's a lot of water on the paper. So that was able to be done easily, and I had no problem with that. So you can see now I'm going in, and at this point I'm not too worried if some of the blue overlaps over the tentacles. I am going to go over those tentacles with some more of that. It's like a peachy color. I'm going to go over those again, and certain areas that I went over too dark with and went over with the blue too dark, I will lift off some of that blue. It's not a problem to lift that off. So you can see I'm just blending in the background, and now I'm going back to the octopus. So that was while the octopus was drying, and now I'm gone back in, and I'm defining some of the areas where I went over with the blue, going over it with that octopus color again, and then also paying attention to some of those details or shadow areas that I wanted to define for the texture, because you can see the texture is it has a very unique texture, so I wanted to try to have that when I did the painting. Now I wanted to include some bubbles, so I drew in 3 bubbles, but I wasn't very happy with them, so I just went over with the white Posca pen. That didn't really cover it much, so I just used the Posca to go over, to get that texture on the skin of the octopus. And you don't see it much now, but I am gonna go over it again later on. It's this little white, very light dots that are over its body, but I'm gonna define that later on. I've also used some white color pencil, and then now I'm just using a white jelly roll just to go over some of those suction things on the tentacles, just to go over them and add a little bit of extra dimension to it, and just have that white, which just makes it pop a bit better than having it all just painted with one color, or not one color, but have it painted, just let it pop with that white because it really stands out. And yeah, I'm going in, looking at my reference, seeing what I need to. And also at this point, I think I looked at the reference, but then I put it away, because at this point I think is when I really want to see what I want my vision of the image, of what I wanted the illustration to turn out, of what I wanted it to turn out like. So I was glancing at the reference just to make sure I am on the right track with the texture of the octopus, but I am trying to really use my own mind and imagination, and try to use my creative liberties of being an artist to try to see my creative mind, what I want to add and what I want to leave out, or what I want to change at this point in the illustration. So it's a very thoughtful process when you're going through this piece. You can see now with the bubbles, I went in with some darker blues, and then I'm going to use the white to add those little shines to them. I am using a hair dryer in between to dry the layers. It just speeds up my drying time. And yes, and then I'm going to just add some highlights here and there to the bubbles, to the eye, and just wherever I feel that I think it needs a little bit more work. Like I said, I go again to the bubbles, add more darker blue, dry it up, and add more highlights to it. I think that really can help bring the piece together by having these little bubbles and having those little highlights. The white really brings everything together and really makes everything pop. So that's a very important thing for illustrations, I feel. So I guess that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it helpful. If you have, don't forget to like and share. It really helps the channel out. Also, if you'd like to see other art videos and art content, I do have a Patreon where you can see what I offer, and if that's something for you, the link will be in the description box below. And I also upload a lot of art content and art videos on my YouTube channel, so you could maybe consider subscribing, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified as soon as my next video is uploaded. So thanks again so much for watching. Till the next one, bye.